Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this video I'm going to explain my UI, since it's a topic that I commonly get asked about, and I'd like to have something to point people to, rather than giving the full explanation about it multiple times. I'm mostly going to be talking about the main weak Aura elements in the center of my screen, but since I'm on the topic of my UI anyway, I will talk about my other UI elements afterwards. So, let's get started. There's a lot to unpack with this condensed block of weak auras in the center of my screen, so I'm going to go through each of the elements one at a time. First, this entire collection is built on top of and around my health bar, which is the red bar in the center of the panel. There's nothing too fancy about it, but as a tank, knowing how much health I have at any given time is very important, so it deserves to be in the center of my screen. Second, I have 4 general positions on top of my health bar where color-coded icons are displayed. In short, these icons are telling me what to use for my core rotation, and they are programmed with an optimized action priority list that is also listed in my written Blood Death Knight guide. But let me explain how it is doing that, since it probably isn't obvious just from looking at it. As you can see in this video, both the icons and the color of these icons are changing based on a number of conditions. Each icon symbolizes a corresponding ability, while the color and location determine the priority of the ability. Starting with the ability symbols, the crossed swords are Dancing Rune Weapon, the skull is Morrowind, the droplet is Blood Boil, the mushroom is Death and Decay, the spiky aura is Tombstone, the sword emblem is Heartstrike, and an outer circle is used for Deathstrike. Furthermore, each icon then has a color that indicates its priority. For this, I generally use pink, red, yellow, green, and blue for standard priorities, where pink is the highest priority color and blue is the lowest. Purple indicates that a priority is only used in special conditions that are difficult to track with weak auras for whatever reason, and it doesn't always correspond to a priority lower than blue, so keep that in mind. For example, a purple Morrowind or purple Heartstrike means that I should only use the ability if I am not going to use Dancing Rune Weapon on cooldown, while a purple Deathstrike symbol should only be used if I am fighting a single target, or if I am in a situation where I only care about damage done to a single target. Finally, I also use an off-white color to indicate when an ability is usable, but when my priority list is not currently telling me to use it. If 2 icons have the same priority color at the same time, then the icon furthest to the left has priority. So, just taking color and positioning into account, here is how everything would be prioritized using a simplified structure. Using all combinations of the 5 general colors and 4 positions that I have presented here would allow me to display up to 20 unique priorities, where 4 would be visible at any given time. Granted, sometimes I have multiple icons in the same location at the same time, and in these situations, the outer icon gets priority over the regular icon. So, a similar colored Tombstone would get priority over Death and Decay, while Deathstrike on single targets would get priority over Heartstrike. I generally only do this for talent abilities, covenant abilities, and abilities I may not want to use rotationally, as well as abilities with special conditions attached. Additionally, some icons may also show as being faded. For Morrowind and Tombstone, this means that I need more runes before I want to use the ability, and that I should refrain from using Heartstrike in the meantime so I can actually save up to this required rune count. While a faded Heartstrike means that I'll have a rune available to use Heartstrike in the next 1.5 seconds. I get that this setup isn't very user-friendly, but since I'm very familiar with what everything means, I can very effortlessly perform my rotation because of it. And since I maintain an optimized APL for the class, it's nice to be able to give the APL a test drive in real content to make sure that there's nothing weird going on that wasn't obvious from the simulations I ran to develop it. If you want to find the written guide where I have this rotation written out in detail, you can find a link in the video description. In addition to the larger ability icons I just talked about, there are smaller icons as well that show up in the same locations. The circular progress texture on the far left is a visual display of Bone Shield duration, since sometimes I may want to refresh Bone Shield at the end of a pull. The bloodlust-like symbol in the center left indicates that Raise Dead can't be used. The swirly icon on the center right indicates that Blood Tap can be used, and this Blood Tap icon can turn pink if it is being prioritized or white if it is simply usable while not a priority ability. And the skull and crossbones symbol on the far right indicates that Sacrificial Pact is usable, where this icon turns purple during the last 10 seconds of my Raise Ghoul uptime, where it could be a good ability to use for AoE DPS in those circumstances. All three of these abilities are either off of the global cooldown or very situational, so I don't want them getting in the way of my main rotation display. That's why they are shown as miniature icons instead of the larger icons that are used for my regular rotational abilities. In addition to all of these ability icons, you'll notice that the background of this weak aura bundle sometimes changes color. It will change to a hot pink color if I drop below 70% health and I'm able to use Deathstrike, indicating that regardless of what the rest of my rotation icons are saying, I should probably Deathstrike instead to stay alive. And if I drop below 70% health and I don't have enough runic power to use Deathstrike, the background instead turns to a light gray color, which is usually a warning for me to start playing very defensively. In other patches, I've used health thresholds lower than 70%, but in this patch, since the main reason I'm going to be dying is due to burst damage, and because we have such insane runic power generation due to our tier set bonus, it's very easy to sustain a high threshold for death striking without running out of runic power. Continuing on, the icon and the number to the lower left of my health bar is a rune counter, and the backdrop changes from green to red when I am in combat. Knowing my exact rune count isn't too important given how the rest of my weak auras work, but I'm showing it here regardless. The main value of this icon is just to show whether or not I'm in combat. Meanwhile, the box and number to the lower right of my health bar is my runic power counter. The color of the box is red by default, but it changes to yellow when Deathstrike is usable, and then it turns green when I have enough power to use a fully powered Bone Storm. Maybe someday I'll have a good reason to use Bone Storm again, but it has been a while since I've actually used the talent seriously. Now, let us talk about the colored rectangles above and below the health bar, which all correspond to usable and non-rotational utility abilities. When any of these abilities are on cooldown, they turn into a white progress bar that becomes visible for the last 15 seconds of the ability cooldown. Here is a listing for what utility abilities are being represented by each of the colored rectangles. Across the top, from left to right, we have my on-use trinket, my engineering belt enchant, my covenant signature ability, my racial ability, and death's advance. Across the bottom, from left to right, we have Death Grip, Gorfiend's Grasp, Dark Command, Asphyxiation, and Mind Freeze. None of these abilities are rotational, but I very much want to be aware of whether or not I can use them at any given time. Next, we'll talk about the weak auras that make up and surround the Horde symbol on the left. They are similar to the utility cooldown bars, except that they deal with my defensive abilities and in-combat consumables. The blue circle in the upper left corresponds to Anti-Magic Zone. The red part of the Horde symbol is Vampiric Blood. The yellow part of the Horde symbol is Dancing Rune Weapon. The orange circle in the upper right is my Health Potion cooldown. The purple diamond in the center is my Combat Potion cooldown. The bottom left circle is Lichborn. The green part of the Horde symbol is Anti-Magic Zone. The blue part of the Horde symbol is Icebound Fortitude, and the red X in the bottom right is a 2-segment weak aura for both charges of Rune Tap. Similar to my general utility abilities, these also turn into white progress bars when they are on cooldown, so I have a general idea for when they will be available again. Related to my defensive abilities is a colored progress bar that can show up to the right of my health bar. A yellow progress bar indicates that Dancing Rune Weapon is active, and a blue progress bar indicates that I have some other major defensive cooldown or external active. These used to be a shared single bar, but the tier set made it necessary to split out Dancing Rune Weapon because of how high of Dancing Rune Weapon uptimes we can get nowadays. In any case, it's useful to see the duration of these buffs so that I have an idea of how much proactive mitigation I have active at any given time, and that also stops me from stacking defensive cooldowns when it isn't necessary. A pink bar can also show up here if I'm being affected by the increased rune regeneration from Crimson Rune Weapon, which used to be a good period of time to use Rune Tap, since the extra rune regeneration could offset the cost of Rune Tap. But our defensive uptime nowadays has been so high that using Rune Tap isn't as necessary anymore, even in higher content. Finally, I have a Control Undead panel that comes out to the left of the Horde symbol if I have a unit controlled, displaying unit health, Control Undead duration, and what stance the pet is in. Outside of these weak auras, the rest of my UI is a lot more standard. So let's move on to my nameplates. I actually use tidy plates, threat plates for my nameplates, with special markings for both my current target and my focus target. Most people seem to use Plater nowadays, and I probably should as well, but I haven't had much of a reason to make the swap myself, since Tidy Plates does everything I need my nameplates to do, at least when combined with big debuffs and a few weak auras in particular. Of particular note, having weak auras that show enemy spell targets on top of the nameplate, as well as their ability cooldowns, can be extremely useful in Mythic Plus, and I would greatly encourage people to get these weak auras if they don't have them already. Every other part of my user interface that is close to my character is information I want to look at while I'm in combat. I have a separate health bar and cast bar for my focus target to the left of my character, as well as specific keybinds for Focus Kick, Focus Stun, and Focus Grip. I have Deadly Boss Mod bars that show up just to the left of my custom weak aura panel. Speaking of boss mods, I try not to track any boss cooldowns that are not important to what I am doing. I'll add countdowns to any mechanic that I need to prepare for or react to instantly, and I'll use sound effects based on how I am supposed to react to any given mechanic. For example, I use the same warning sound when I am standing in a bad ground effect that I should move out of. I use a foghorn for any mechanic that can lead to my death if I don't react to immediately. I use an acoustic guitar for any sort of ad spawn, and I have other sound effects that work in similar ways. In general, I think it's a great idea to pair specific sound effects that call for specific reactions from you. And it's probably one of the most effective ways you can make use of sound effects, as long as you don't go too overboard with them to the point where you just stop listening to them. That being said, I don't think I've had a chance to filter boss abilities from the Tazavesh dungeons yet. I should probably do that at some point. For party frames, I use Grid 2, which is probably smaller than most people's party frames, but all I really need these party frames for is to check the general health of my group and to target dead people when I need to resurrect them with Raise Ally. Neither of these things actually require large frames, so I'm perfectly fine with using these smaller ones. And if I'm in a raid, the party frames expand to the right to show the entire raid. But in a party, I instead display specific group information. Omni Cooldown is used for group cooldown tracking next to my party frames when I'm in a group, and interrupt tracking is located just to the right of my custom weak aura panel. The goal with party cooldown tracking is that I shouldn't ever need to ask my group about the remaining cooldown on any of their abilities. But at the same time, I shouldn't be tracking any ability that will never be relevant to what I'm going to do personally. However, For any externals that I potentially want to use as a substitute for a personal defensive cooldown, such as Blessing of Sacrifice, Darkness, and Force of Nature, along with a few others, I track these cooldowns to the left of my defensive cooldowns, so I just don't need to look into two locations at once when I'm cycling defensive cooldowns. And since I'm not going to track my own cooldowns next to my own party frame, since I'm already doing this in my weak aura panel, I instead have healer mana and healer drinking status next to my party frame, which can be very useful in Mythic Plus content just to make sure that your healer has begun drinking before you pull the next pull, or to check to see if you need to stop pulling at all, because if they have high mana, then there's no real reason for you to stop in the first place. I also have separate trackers for Bloodlust, Battle Res timers, and an icon for showing if my Battle Res is usable to the left of my grid, because this is information I'd like to know in combat and it isn't listed anywhere else. The Battle Res information in particular is useful to have next to my party frames, since that's where I'm going to be looking if I need to see if I need to Battle Res someone in the first place. Additionally, I track some specific debuffs above the right-hand side of my custom weak aura panel, such as Necrotic Wound. Not a lot of debuffs are useful to track, so I just want to make sure that any debuffs I actually care about are displayed near the center of my screen so I can just ignore the rest. Moving to the outside of my screen is information I shouldn't be looking at while I am in combat, but it has enough value that I don't want to remove it from my UI entirely. The upper right corner is just a bunch of standard UI elements, such as the minimap, all of my buffs, and all of my debuffs. The bottom left is a fully transparent chat box that you cannot see, and the lower right is a mix of details, menu buttons, and a Bagnon inventory button. And while I can only see them when I mouse over them, I have Domino's action bars at the bottom of my screen if I need to change or check keybinds for whatever reason. The only exception to this is my pet bar, which is always visible when I am using Control Undead, since some enemies have abilities that need to be toggled on and off, and I don't have any better ideas for how to track the status of these abilities. The upper left corner has a network of weak auras that make it easy to track consumable status, and it tells me what my currently equipped Runeforge is with a colored icon. The Runeforge information used to be a lot more valuable in 9.0 and 9.1 when you could swap weapons in Mythic Plus, but because you can't swap weapons with the Jailer weapon, it won't be as useful in 9.2, assuming I eventually get my hands on a Mythic Jailer weapon. While I'm not normally looking at it, I also keep the default target frame around for the right-click menu and if I need to check target buff status out of combat. To the right of my target frame, I also have clickable weak auras that appear if I'm missing a consumable to allow me to apply them quickly without wasting a keybind or opening my inventory. Overall, the general design of my UI is based around the concept that information important to my in-combat decision-making is close to my character, while anything on the outside of my UI is rarely, if ever, used for that purpose and is mostly there for quality of life purposes. However, there's a dead zone in the center of my UI that I never want to put information into, since I need to be able to see around my character to position myself for various abilities. I think any unnecessary UI elements distract my attention and make me play worse, so I try to minimize both the amount and size of UI elements on my screen, as long as the remaining elements aren't small to the point where I have trouble reading them. Also, if there is any way that I can get my UI to help streamline decision-making for me, I'm more than willing to let it take over that job as long as I think it is something that it can do well. That is why I automate large portions of my rotation, so I can pay more attention to other things. And there you have it. That's a general explanation for my UI. If you would like to make it easier for other Blood Death Knights to find this content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there are any additional topics you'd like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about UI design, feel free to leave a comment below. I can be contacted through Discord, and my information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.